This hour on i24News, President Trump steps in front of reporters, defends the first 4 weeks of his administration, and ridicules the media.
Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, says the Trump administration still supports a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, despite the president's stated ambivalence. Welcome back. The international community is pushing back against President Trump's suggestion on Wednesday that he would be open to a one-state solution to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Joining us to discuss the treatment of Palestinians in Israel is Shireen Tadros from Amnesty International and Shahar Azani with Stand With Us. Shireen, would you agree that Palestinians in Israel, regardless of whether there's one state or two states, that their situation right now is actually better than a lot of minorities in some of the neighboring Arab nations?
Well, I mean, I think it's really difficult to make that sort of comparison because we have to talk about the context with which they're living in, and they're living under an occupation, a 50-year occupation of Palestinian land. So you have to take it from the perspective of rights given to a Palestinian population by an occupying power. And what Amnesty International have been documenting, not over the past year, but over the past many years, is a continuous violation of very basic rights of Palestinians, whether we're talking about in the occupied West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and of course the continuing settlements built on internationally recognized Palestinian land.
Shahar, is that the issue?
That is the worst distraction that we could ever find, because settlements, which began in '67, and yet the hostilities towards the Jewish state started many, many years before. I wish to attract the attention to one important thing. It is time for both sides to sit and negotiate directly, rather than having an imposed solution, whether by the international community or by the American administration. And this is the main message we heard yesterday, and we hope the Palestinians will finally listen to the call made by the Israeli government in the past years, sit and negotiate, and by doing so will relieve their own plight by negotiating directly with Israel.
Shireen, one of the issues that President Trump brought up during the press conference with Netanyahu is the fact that Palestinians are taught to hate Jews and Israelis through their school curriculum, that hatred and terrorism is incited, and that the 1993 Oslo Accords have really been dismissed because the Palestinians haven't kept to that promise. How is that impacting their rights if, as children, they're taught to hate and not really been given a chance?
Well, I mean, I guess I take issue with this idea that they're taught to hate. Again, this is an occupation, and they grow up seeing that occupation very, very visibly. I spent the last 10 years covering this conflict and living in these areas.
The school books vilify Jews. They paint them in Holocaust type of situations with horns out of their heads. The UN has done a study on the actual textbooks that are used to teach them. Is that not an infringement of their human rights, that they're not even given a chance to form opinions?
I mean, on the infringement of human rights of the Palestinian people, no, it's not. What it is of course, anything that promotes this sort of, us versus them and hatred of both sides is definitely to be condemned. But unfortunately, this happens on both sides. On both sides, we're seeing this, this constant vilification and hatred, and it's being played out on the ground when people see their parents being subjected to very humiliating treatment at checkpoints and so on. This is all very dangerous, and where I think we agree is that what we need is a solution so that both can live in peace.
And the solution, of course, requires the first step of people being able to empathize with the other side. Shahar, would you acknowledge that Palestinians feel just as passionately against the feelings that they're second-class citizens, just as passionately that this land belongs to them, as the Israelis feel about, well, wait a second, this land belongs to us?
Every sensible human being who wants to solve this conflict understands that there are two sides. But here is the challenge. When will be the time when we actually speak about education being the key word here and not settlements? Because we have lost how many generations since the signing of the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s? How many children were born into the post-Oslo reality and were bred on the incitement and education that the anti-Semitic caricatures on Palestinian textbooks and media?
But part of that education comes from the fact that Palestinian children look up and hear their parents say, hey, that was our land, and now we see Israelis building more settlements on it, and they have to try to understand that. So wouldn't it help if the Israelis took an initial step of saying, okay, we're going to freeze the settlements as a good faith gesture to try to tamp down frustrations.
Right, which is exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government did at the beginning of Obama's term, 9-month settlement freeze, which resulted in Palestinian intransigence and refusal to sit and negotiate. So here is the key: sit and negotiate only with the two parties sitting and talking among themselves, because peace will not come from New York, Stockholm, Geneva, or Rome. It will come and emanate between Ramallah and Jerusalem.
Shireen, you agree?
How can you talk about a two-state solution or any sort of peace when you have, actual land being taken and being built on? I mean, if someone once described it to me like this: it's like saying, how are we going to divide this pizza while someone's eating the pizza? It's impossible, and it's made the two-state solution, frankly speaking, completely non-viable on the ground. And for the past 10 years that people on the ground, both Israelis and Palestinians, have been talking about how this is not a viable solution anymore because there are hundreds of thousands of people living on Palestinian land. It just is nonsensical. So no, I do think that settlements are a big issue. They should be talked about. It's not about education or settlements. It's about, as a first step, freezing settlements before you dismantle them.
But can't there be a phrase at the same time that the Palestinians say, okay, we do recognize Israel's right to exist, and we do recognize that Israel can have overall security to make sure the region is safe?
That Palestinians have recognized Israel's right to exist several times. That's not an issue.
We talk about several parties coming together and talk, the two parties, but the Palestinians are divided, you could say, with Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas has just elected a new leader, Sinwar, who is committed to the destruction of Israel, who says that he's not open to negotiations. So is it really a question of two parties then talking when the Palestinians seem to be frayed between Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there has been a problem with the Palestinian leadership in general, and the lack of Palestinian leadership, quite honestly. But also, this has been a conversation we've been having for decades. There is no partner for peace. I feel like, every year we continue to say the same thing. When are we actually going to stop and look at the obstacles to peace, like the settlements, like what's going on in other parts of the West Bank, like the siege of Gaza and the blockade that has been happening since 2007?
But also like the violence, which is another issue. But
like the violence that happens in the West Bank against Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians.
But also the violence that happens from Palestinian militants and terrorists who are taking the lives of innocent civilians. We've got to end it there. Shireen Tadros and Shahrazani, thank you both so much for coming in. We appreciate it. A lively discussion, and that's what we love.
Lively indeed. And